Welcome to Game Fondue Reviews. In this video, we're going to take a look at Blue Moon Legends. Blue Moon Legends is the collected version of Blue Moon, which is a two-player card game designed by Reiner Knizia. Let's jump right in with the description of the rules, see if the example terms being played. Then I'll be back for some closing remarks. This is set up for Blue Moon Legends. In your first game, it's recommended you use the two introductory decks, which are the Volca and the Hoax, though there are a whole bunch of other decks to choose from that are pre-built, as well as some customizable options, which we'll touch on later in the game. And it's easy to tell which deck is which because they all have a matching letter. You can see here it's V for Volca. So that's how you form this deck of cards, and your leader just goes to the side. That you take your deck, you shuffle them up, and you draw a hand of 6. Aside from that, you just put the 3 dragons in the center of the board, so both players have access to them. The game is played in alternating turns composed of 8 phases, which occur in the following order: beginning phase, leadership phase, engagement phase, character phase, booster/support phase, power phase, refresh phase, and end phase. And they're all right here listed on the board for you to see. And you continue playing like this until one player attracts the 4th dragon to their side of the board. There's only 3, so if you were to attract the 4th, you win immediately. Or essentially if a fight ends and one player has no cards left in his or her hand. But we'll talk about that in more detail later in the video. So the first phase of the turn is the beginning phase, and the current player, that's whoever's turn it is, resolves any face-up uncovered card effects. Any of your face-up uncovered cards in this game are essentially called active. So you would resolve any active card effects that occurred during your beginning phase. Also at this time, if you have any active cards with the retrieve symbol, that's this little arrow here, you can essentially take those cards back to your hand. The one exception there is if your opponent has a character card. This is a character card. It says the type of card it is right on the side, and it goes in your combat area as opposed to some other cards which go in your support area. If your opponent has a face-up character card with that retrieve symbol, you cannot retrieve your character back, even if he has a retrieve symbol. But you can still retrieve any number of other cards back to your hand that have the retrieve symbol, and that's totally optional, and that occurs during the beginning phase. Lastly, the current player may land any number of their active ship cards and may discard any number of their bluff cards, but we're not going to cover these concepts in too much detail in this video because they're for more advanced versions of the game. Notably, the Buka pre-built deck has a lot of those effects. Next is the leadership phase, and what happens in that phase is you can play one leadership card to your leader area. Alternatively, you could also use cards with a retrieve power. Instead of playing one leadership card, you can discard one of these cards from your hand to draw another card from your deck. In more advanced versions of the game, there's also some Hyla, ship, and achievement cards that count as leadership cards and essentially can be played at this time, but you're still limited to one card maximum, whether it be a leadership card or a ship card being played. Also, any leadership cards are played in your leader area, and that's significant because they are never discarded. This is your discard pile, and that's only for your combat and support cards. After the leadership phase is the engagement phase. If there's not currently a fight taking place, the current player either starts one or declines to start one. If the player starts a fight, he just moves on to the character phase. That's his entire engagement phase. Alternatively, if he decides not to start one, he discards 1 to 3 cards from his hand and then draws back up to 6, and his turn is immediately over. You don't do any of the remaining phases. It's the next player's turn. On the other hand, if there's already a fight taking place, the player can either continue it or retreat from it. If the player decides to continue it, he just moves on to the character phase. That's his whole engagement phase. If the player does not want to continue the fight for any reason, or cannot meet the power requirement to continue, which we'll talk about in a bit, or doesn't have a character card in his hand, he retreats from the fight. When you retreat from a fight, the other player wins and gets to attract dragons. Normally they get to attract 1 dragon, but if they have 6 or more cards in their combat and support areas, they get to attract 2 dragons. When you're attracting dragons, you always have to attract dragons the other player has. So if this player over here won, for instance, he would first have to attract one of these dragons from the other player's area to the board. But if all of the dragons are already on the board, then you can start attracting to your own area. And again, if you ever had 3 dragons in your area and were to attract a 4th, you immediately win the game. After the winner finishes attracting dragons, both players discard all combat and support cards in their areas to their discard pile. Leadership cards, remember, don't go to the discard pile, but they're still discarded in the leader area, and any active leader cards, even those played this turn, no longer have an effect. Finally, both players draw back up to 6 cards, and the retreating player, the player who lost a fight, begins a new turn. They get to take another turn at this time. But if you did continue the fight and you didn't retreat, or you didn't decline to start, you move on to the character phase. So you must play one character during the character phase. If you didn't have a character, you had to retreat because you have to play one. If there was already one here in your area and you play another character, he essentially would cover up that character and he would no longer be active. Following the character phase is the booster/support phase, and normally you can play 1 booster or 1 support card, but it's 1 card maximum. We'll talk about each of those cards in a moment. But if you did start the fight this turn, there was no fight and you started it, normally you cannot play any cards, though there are some card effects that will allow you to play a card even though you normally cannot do so. But generally speaking, if you start the fight, you don't get to play a booster or support that turn. Booster cards say booster on them, of course,
like this, and they're played over top partially of your active character. They don't cover them up totally, but they will be covered up the following turn when you play a character on top of that group. Support cards, however, get played in the support area, and they get played next to each other. They don't cover each other up. They look like this. They say support, and you just put them over here, and they have some type of effect. It's also important to note in this game, when you play cards with effects, you read it out loud as if you were reading it. So, for instance, this card says you cannot play leadership cards. That doesn't mean that you, the person who played it, can't play leadership cards. It means you, the person that you're playing against, cannot play leadership cards. So it's important to read these as if you were saying them to your opponent. Also, in non-introductory versions of the game, you can play cards with a bluff icon face down at this time. You can see the bluff icon essentially is a question mark, and they come in different colors corresponding to different element colors, which we'll talk about in a bit. And instead of playing a booster or support, this still counts towards your 1 card limit. You play it face down, and it adds 2 in the contested element to your current score. But we're not going to be worrying about those too much in this game. You can also load ships at this time by playing a character, a booster, or a support into a ship. But again, that's a more advanced concept that we're not really going to talk about in this video. So after you finish your booster / support phase, you move on to your power phase. If you started the fight this turn, you get to declare the contested element. It's either going to be fire or earth, and you just get to lay that out and declare what it is in your total power. Your total power is the value of your active characters, support, and booster cards all added together. So if it was this player's turn over here, and he had this 2 red up here, and this 2 booster red on it, note that everything has a power in earth and in fire, and that's the different color here. So his total would be 2 + 2, or 4. But on a later turn, when he covered this guy up, all of those would be totally covered, so you no longer get that booster bonus anymore, and it would be 2. This is very significant because if you cannot reach the power level of the opponent, you have to at least tie them, certainly okay to exceed them. You have to essentially backtrack to the engagement phase and retreat. In this phase, the only other thing that can happen besides announcing your power is if you're playing with bluff cards, your opponent can call your bluff at this time, in which you have to reveal them, and there are certain results that can happen, including attracting dragons. But we're not going to worry about that too much for right now. The refresh phase is simply the active player drawing back up to 6 cards, and the end phase is any card effects that happen during the end of your turn occur at this time. So that brings us to the end of the game. The game can end in one of 3 ways. The one we already talked about is if you get all 3 dragons and then you attract 1 more to your side, you win immediately. But the game also ends if after a fight a player has played or discarded the last card of their hand and draw deck. You got to be totally out of cards. Or if a player declines to start a fight and has no cards in their hand or draw deck. So in both cases, essentially after a fight if a player has no cards left. In that case, whoever has the most dragons on their side wins. If all the dragons are in the center, it's whoever had cards in their hand last wins. So if you're the person that ran out of cards first, unfortunately, you will lose in that situation. Before we go through the playthrough, I just want to go over a couple other icons that do come up in games. This is the shield icon, and what that does is if you have this character in your area in front of you, during the announcement of your power level, you get to ignore the other guy's thing in that type. So this guy gets to ignore the other guy's earth value. So you can get through a turn where maybe you didn't have as much power as you hoped you have. This is the stop icon, this little hand here that says no. And the significance of that is this has to be the last card you played during your turn. So you play this guy, you don't get to play anything else after, even though there may be some other phases where you get to play cards. The free icon is this little star here, and essentially what that means is this guy doesn't count as your 1 card played. So you can play him and then play another card if you'd like to. You could even play a whole bunch of cards with the free icon, so you could have a whole bunch of characters for 1 turn, but they would all be covered the following turn. Next is the pair icon, and that's essentially just these 2 heads together. If you ever have 2 characters with the same first name and they both have the pair icon, so for instance, this Guardian and Guardian, it's the same first word in their total name, they can be played together as 1 card. And that can even combo with the free icon. If one of them also has the free icon, the pair doesn't count as playing a card, so you can even play something else after that. Very similar to the pair icon is the gang icon, and that's essentially this little swirl here. It works pretty much the same, except there's no limit to the number. Pairs, come in 2. But gangs, you can play a whole bunch of them if there's more. But there are different colors, like this is the yellow one, that one was the red symbol. So you could essentially play 3 of these in a turn. It's also possible that you just have one of these face up here. If so, you can play new guys your new turn and the following turn without covering him up. So that can be very interesting because normally you have to cover up the character when you play. And lastly is the protect icon, and the protect icon just looks like this little helmet here. And what that does is this card can totally ignore any other opponent effects that affect him. The opponent cannot affect this guy because he is protected. And the last thing I want to talk about before the playthrough is deck building. Blue Moon Legends is really designed for customized play, although there are a whole lot of pre-built decks that are a lot of fun, just the same. But you're going to pick one of the leaders, and they're essentially all 30 card decks with 10 blue moon points here. And you can see on different cards there are some moon symbols in the bottom. Like this one costs 1 moon, And then there's some really good cards that cost 3 moons, things like that. So when you're customizing your deck, you get that leader and this whole deck that comes with him, but you can make up to a certain number of changes based on the number of moons. You still got to have 30 cards, but you can bring in cards from other areas that have a whole bunch of moons on them to make some really neat combos and things like that. There are also emissary cards that offer quick deck building by adding unaffiliated tribesmen and cards associated with that emissary. So that's just a little more customization. That's neat. And there's inquisitors, which basically do the same thing as these, except they give you a permanent effect and they add more cards. You might be +5 cards, some type of effect that always applies you through the game, and some additional moon points, so you can make some bigger, neater decks and have fun with that. There's also a draft variant, which is, you draft out the cards and build a deck that way, which is really neat as well. So there's a lot of ways to enjoy this game. Let's go with this example playthrough. Normally players' cards are for their eyes only, but they're face up here to make it easy. We're going to have this player go first, but normally it's going to be totally random. So the first part of the turn is the beginning phase. Obviously he has nothing out here that could have any beginning effects, and he has nothing to retrieve with any retrieve effects. Remember, this is a retrieve effect, so if this was in front of the player, he could take it back to his hand at that time. Next is the leadership phase, so he could play a card to his leader area. He does have some leadership cards, but he doesn't know that he wants to use them yet because there's no real conflict going on, so he's going to wait a little bit to do so. So he's not going to play any cards during his leadership phase, though he does have 3 in his hand. Next is engagement, so he's got to decide, since there's no fight, if he wants to start one or to decline to start one. He says, you know what, I'm definitely going to start one. So he's going to say fire, and he's going to throw out his, because he started one, he moves on this character phase, so he's going to throw out his character here that has 3 fire value. And remember, you can always choose fire or earth. It's totally up to you. Now it's the booster support phase, but because he started the fight this turn, he doesn't get to play any booster support cards, although he has 1 of each. But remember, he could only play 1, not 1 of each, because that's the normal thing. So he declares his power. His power is 3 fire. That means the other player needs to at least get up to 3 fire during their turn in order to continue the fight. Next is refresh. He goes back up to 6 cards. He has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 in his hand, so he's just going to draw 1 from his deck, and he has no end phase effects out on the board yet. Also note that some of the pre-built decks have cards from different affiliations, but they still have the V to indicate that they're in that corresponding group. That's totally okay. So we move on to the other guy's turn, and the first part is the beginning phase. Again, nothing. Next is leadership phase. He's thinking he may want to do that because he has a leadership card, but he's going to save it for a little bit later because he knows he can definitely get up to 3. So engagement, he either has to decide to continue the fight or retreat. He's not really ready to retreat quite yet, so he's going to continue the fight. And that means he's got to play at least 1 character. Remember, if you have no characters, you have to retreat because the character phase is totally mandatory. Pretty much everything else is optional, but he decides to lay out his character here. This guy has 1 attack power. So then he, in fire, remember he has 3 in earth, but we're only talking about fire now. So we move on to the booster support, and he can play 1 booster support card, although he has a whole bunch in his hand. He's going to play this one here, the battling boomerang, and that adds 2. So he declares his power value. His power is 3, which matches this, so he was okay. If for some reason he continued the fight and could not reach this power level, he'd have to backtrack to the retreat part and continue that way. So next is refresh. He only has 4 cards in his hand, so he gets to draw back up to 2, and we're going to continue the battle because nothing happens to him during the end phase. It's going to be the next guy's turn. We're going to jump a little bit ahead in this fight so you can see some more interesting situations. Welcome back. It's this guy's turn now. This unfortunately got discarded by a leadership card the other guy played. He was hoping to retrieve that back to his hand and things like that. But it's this guy's turn now. It's the beginning phase. He has no effects out there. The leadership phase, he decides he's not going to play a card this turn. But engagement, he's up against a 4 and the ability, if you retreat, meaning if he retreats, I attract 1 additional dragon. So he doesn't like that. So he definitely doesn't want to lose this particular battle. So he decides he's going to continue the fight. And for a character, he's going to play this guy right here with 5 strength. That's a very strong. It's one of his strongest guys. And for booster support, he's going to lay out this support card that adds another 3. So he announces his power as 8, which is significantly higher than this guy's 4, so that's okay. Then he refreshes by drawing 2 cards because he's currently at 4, and you always go back up to 6. So he does so, and then his turn is over. It's back to this guy's turn. So in the leadership phase, he decides not to play a card, so he goes on the engagement phase, and he says, absolutely, I'm continuing this fight, knowing that he's up against 8 in the contested element, which is fire. So he plays this guy right here, which is worth 4, and for his booster support, he's going to put this booster card on top of this, which doubles the value of his character card. So his character card is at 8, and remember, support cards stay active as long as they're out there, unless something discards them, like that leadership effect did previously. But the booster card will be covered up by the next character card. So right now his attack is 8. that is equal to the opponent, so that's okay. So he refreshes his hand by drawing 2 cards. So this guy's turn is finished. Now we're going to go into this guy's turn. Beginning phase, nothing happens because he doesn't have any effects that occurred during the beginning phase, and he has no cards that he could possibly retrieve. The only one he has is unfortunately in the discard pile. Leadership phase, he's not going to do anything in engagement. He's very upset because this was his highest value he could obtain. He doesn't have enough cards that would total a value, because if he was to cover this guy up, he's only getting weaker and he can't get back up to 8. So he's forced to retreat, because if he was to continue, he would get to the power phase, he wouldn't be high enough, and he'd have to backtrack, and everybody would be upset. So he's going to retreat, and what happens when he retreats is, first thing we're going to do is attract dragons. Now, normally this guy would attract 1 dragon, because he has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 cards here, which is not 6 or more, so he gets 1. But this card says, if you retreat, I attract 1 additional dragon. So he gets 2 dragons over to his side. So he's 2 dragons away from winning. Now in the future, when this player attracts dragons back, they have to go to the center first. He can't take this guy to his area. You always have to pull from the other guy's thing before, and then if they're all neutral, then you can start bringing them over. But point being, this guy has 2 dragons, then everybody's going to discard their cards, everything that was in front of them. Leadership cards don't get discarded in your normal pile, but still inactive, although this leadership card has been inactive for a while, so you can discard that however you'd like. But these all do the same. And then you're essentially just going to draw back up to 6 cards, and the contested element goes away. There's no fight currently happening. So it's this guy's turn. He draws back up to 6. He already has 6 cards, so that's it. And then he retreated, so he's going to start the next turn. And he decides during his turn the same process if he wants to start a fight or decline starting a fight, and then we go from there. We're going to jump ahead closer to the end of the game so you can see the final situation. Welcome back. It's getting near the end of the game. The hoax player just won a battle that brought a dragon over from here. The Vulcan player was winning up until that point. But since this guy retreated, it's his turn, so he's going to play a Glimmer in his character phase because he decided he did want to start a fight. He can't play any boosters of support because he started the fight, but he's going to declare the fight is Earth just because he has 3 Earth and 2 Fire on this guy. So refresh his hand, he can't do it, his deck's empty, so his turn's over. This guy over here, unfortunately, is not going to be able to beat 3 in Earth. He has 3 in Fire, but not enough in Earth, so of course he's forced to retreat. Because he retreats, this guy discards everything in his play area, and he gets one of the dragons here. Now, it's this guy's turn because he retreated, so he's going to start the next fight. He's going to declare it Fire. It's going to be a very similar situation. This guy has nothing he can play to beat it, so it's going to be another retreat situation. So 1 dragon is, of course, attracted to this player. Now, a fight's over, and he has no cards in his hand or deck, so the game ends. Now, because all 3 dragons are in the center, there is no winner by dragons. If there was more dragons on one side, that player would, of course, win. But this guy still has cards in his hand, so he is the winner.
There's a lot of game in this box. There's, 8 different groups, and there's a lot of extra cards that don't even come into play, and then there's all the deck building side to it. There's really a lot you can do with it, and there's a lot of twists and turns, and all the groups have like different abilities, so they do play differently. The gameplay itself, at least the base version of the game, is very simple. It's very easy to teach. There's 8 phases in a turn, which sounds like a lot. Most of them are just, yes, I'm going to continue, or I play 1 card type of thing. So it goes back and forth pretty quickly, and there's kind of always that element of, oh, well, I have this guy's really strong, and I have this card that's really strong, but do I want to use them now to try to get the dragon right away? But what if he counters me? Then I'm going to lose these cards forever. Or either way, what if it would be better to save them forever? So there's kind of always that sort of like pressure luck and trying to read your other opponent type of thing going on. So it's a neat game. It's very simple. And, I think it's best enjoyed when you get into those deeper characters with more abilities and kind of build your own thing. There's really a lot to do there, and, you can customize it, and that's just a lot more fun. The pre-built decks are fine though, so if you just want to do it and try it out that way, that's okay too. But this is a really neat game. I'm glad they put them all together because, the Blue Moon was kind of hard to find nowadays and it's really separated. And then this just kind of puts it all in one box, so that's real neat. If it looked fun to you, check it out. That's Blue Moon Legends.